Well, hello everyone, and welcome from sunny Lisbon to this launch of UFI's Green Paper, VocTech Challenge Green Paper, and this webinar on skills for an economy in transition. My name is Sophie Bailey, and I'm the founder of the EdTech podcast and the co-founder of WorkTrip, and I will be your host during this 1 hour session. So welcome everyone. As you're all joining, please feel free to post in the chat who you are and how you come to this webinar in terms of your perspective and just to get connected to one another. So I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists today, but feel free to jump in the chat and introduce yourselves and who you are. Also, you'll notice on the bottom of our panel here, there's a Q&A button. So feel free also throughout to pose questions in there because they may get lost in the chat. So if you use the Q&A function, I'll periodically be jumping to those and hopefully bringing as much discussion as we can throughout the session. So whilst you're all doing that and whilst more and more of you are joining, so I can see we've got over 60 people already, so fantastic and a big welcome to you all. I'd like to introduce our panelists. So first up, we have Josh Smith, who is Public Affairs Manager at Ufi VocTech Trust. So if you'd like to join the screen, Josh, and give a wave so everyone knows who you are, that would be fab. Also, Dr. Jess Elmore, the Deputy Head of Research at the Learning and Work Institute. So welcome, Jess. Also, I noticed we have the fabulous Richard Ng, co-founder and CTO at Greenworks. So welcome to you, Richard. And Kim Chaplains, specialist advisor at the for work at the Centre for Ageing Better. Welcome, Kim. And last but not least, Rita Davey, who is a skills sector specialist and works at Jaguar Land Rover. So hello, everyone. So thank you so much for being with us. And for context for everyone who's joining, I can see some fabulous introductions going on there, so that's wonderful. This webinar marks the start of a consultation period on the VocTech Challenge, and your responses will help shape both new grant funding from Ufi VocTech Trust and partnership work with the Learning and Work Institute and others over the next 2 years. So there's a very clear call to action during this session. So one is, if you haven't read the Green Paper already, that's been sent to your emails as attendees of this session. So I know that over 100 of you will have received that Green Paper. But also, if you can't find that email and you'd like to access the Green Paper, Thomas is going to very kindly post in the chat the way to download that Green Paper. So essentially, download or dig out from your emails the Green Paper. Make sure you've read that if you haven't already before this session, and feedback both during this session but also via the UFI website. And so the critical areas that we would love to see in terms of feedback are thinking about whether the problem areas identified are the right problems, and we're going to get into that today. Whether you have additional evidence that you have to support or counter this, and what work has already been done to tackle these challenges, so helping us triangulate what's going on and where UFI and the Learning and Work Institute may really have a role to play in order to close the gaps discussed in the Green Paper. And just to underline that point, your feedback will influence where key funds are spent, so don't hold back on that feedback. The more we have on that front, the better that use of funds, so that's really important. But to roll on, we've got some live feedback over this webinar from innovative employers, entrepreneurs and partners. And in a minute, we're going to hear from all of them. But to kick off, let's hear from Josh at UFI and Dr. Jess Elmore at the Learning and Work Institute with an intro to the Challenge programme and some key stats to paint the picture of the current landscape. So Josh, welcome.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. It's a really interesting time for us, and lots going on, and lots still to go on, as you've pointed out. I guess I'll give a quick helicopter tour around the VocTech Challenge, the process that we're going through, and then I'm sure Jess will come in with a lot more depth and detail than I'm able to offer. But so the VocTech Challenge process, it's already taken us on a journey of discovery, so around some of the biggest challenges in the adult learning and skills landscape, thanks to the input of colleagues across the sector and learners and non-learners, practitioners and more. We've been able to pull together our green paper, which sets out 6 key findings about the landscape and then lays down 3 clear problems that we want to see addressed. And they're the things that we're consulting on over the next few weeks, and which will go on to form the backbone of our white paper. So over the next 2 months, we're going to be refining our understanding with the help of the sector and coming together with partners and colleagues to define what it is we can do to address the problems we've identified. We'll be setting this out in a white paper, and it's going to be released on the 6th of June, so keep your eyes out for that. We're going to be able to answer how we can develop a grant call. We're going to build on a programme of strategic partnerships with organisations like Learning and Work, and we're also going to be advocating for change with policymakers and employers and training providers. So a little bit more detail on where we've been so far. So we started with this question: how can VocTech, or the technology that supports vocational learning, help narrow inequalities and ensure every adult can participate in learning throughout their working lives so that the UK has the skills it needs for an economy in transition? What do we mean by an economy in transition? We're in a time of rapid change in the UK economy and labour market. It's going through an unprecedented transition that includes shifting patterns of employment, a changing and ageing workforce, as well as new and emerging types of career, which are all impacting the world of work and skills. But critically, there remain stark and persistent inequalities in adult learning, and that means that those who could benefit most are often least likely to participate in learning. That has implications not only for individuals' earnings, but also health and well-being, and it reinforces disparities that limit the UK's economic growth. Our initial findings were published in a series of blogs, along with Ufi and Learning and Work's research. They have gone on to inform this green paper that we're launching today. The green paper, as I've said, identifies 6 key findings. They are investment and funding, the fragmented skills system, changing skills needs, learner barriers, the digital divide, and the value of learning. I'm sure we'll talk more about those throughout the session. But those research findings led us to lay out 3 problems that we believe provide the biggest challenge for getting the skills the UK needs. That is the skills for an economy in transition, so the skills and learning opportunities that we need to support an economy that is transitioning and those skills are neither clear nor equitably accessible. We need to inspire adults and employers into learning and clearly communicate the benefits to policymakers. We also need to ensure that providers have the evidence of what works. But also the skills system for an economy in transition. The current system is fragmented and failing to keep pace with a shifting landscape. We need a more collaborative and integrated skills system to benefit from devolution, from place-based learning, from growing online and blended learning offers, and the changing mix of national policy and local leadership. We need to better align this system as well to the developments in other areas of policy like regeneration and infrastructure and health. And finally, the digital technology for an economy in transition. When faced with a changing world, we're not acting fast enough to adopt and embed the technology necessary to creating accessible lifelong learning. We need to develop and deploy better technology to provide learning offers that fit around work and home life and build resilient learners whilst embedding a culture of lifelong learning. Our problem statements can be seen through 2 lenses, either a bottom-up lens, focus centred on the individual that considers how adults, particularly career changes and those who are not well served by mainstream provision, experience the system, and a systems view, top-down, that centres on how providers, employers and practitioners experience the same problems, but through a fragmented public policy. I hope you've all had a chance to read the report. There's lots more depth, and I'm sure Jess is going to provide some really interesting insights. I know it's a fascinating read, and I'm really excited to hear more from the individual organisations we've got represented here today, as well as the panellists that Sophie's assembled. A final word from me, just to reiterate that we're consulting on this and we want to hear from you all. So please do get in touch. I'm sure we'll come back to that point many times throughout the day, but please do get in touch through the consultation. It's really invaluable, the feedback that we've had so far, and we know that we'll continue to value that feedback as we go forward, and you have a real chance to influence what we do in the end. As I look forward to hearing from you all, and I'll throw it back to you, Sophie.
Amazing, thank you, Josh. And yeah, just to reiterate that point, do feel free to, where you agree or disagree, either pop that in the chat today, or if you're feeling shy, the UFI website has a wonderful place where you can feedback. So yeah, really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. So Jess, I'd love to turn to you now. The Learning and Work Institute have been a crucial partner in the challenge work that Josh has just described, and also in terms of providing an evidence base on all things skills for an economy and in transition. So I'd love if you're able to share what those headlines are in terms of where we are right now when we think about skills for an economy in transition. What are the things that you'd love to share with everyone here today?
Fantastic. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Josh. So I'm going to come up with a few of the facts and figures that show why this work is so urgent and why we've been so delighted to work with UFI on this green paper through to the white paper and in a partnership for the next 2 years. I think I want to start with saying that we know providers, local authorities, combined authorities, employers, individual learners, policymakers are all doing fantastic things in the adult education space. We have to acknowledge the wonderful work that is going on, but I think we can do better. I think we can do better for people, we can do better for our economy, we can do better for our society. But I do not want to in any way devalue the wonderful work that people are already doing, and that will always be the basis to some of these fairly upsetting statistics that I'm going to go into now. So we know the UK is falling badly behind in skills compared to our competitors, and we know we need a more highly qualified and more skilled workforce in the future. And by skilled, we mean skilled in the broadest sense. We're not just talking about technical qualifications, we're talking about soft skills, we're talking about people skills, being human skills, survival skills. But if we look at where we are now, we've got a long way to go. If we start with qualifications, there are many adults in the UK who don't have any qualifications. So the latest census data suggests that 18% of people in England and Wales, 24% of people in Northern Ireland, and 27% of people in Scotland of those aged over 16 report having no qualifications. Equally, we've got a real challenge when it comes to basic skills. In England and Northern Ireland, 9 million working age adults have low basic skills in either literacy or numeracy, and 5 million have low skills in both. And until we tackle that crisis in basic skills, it's going to be very hard to move on to higher and more technical skills. But looking at technical skills, we're actually pretty good in the UK at producing graduates. We're not so good at producing the technical skills we need in engineers, health and social care professionals, green skills, and we're falling behind in promoting those as well. Alongside the skills gap that we're experiencing, there's been a crisis in adult education funding, and I don't use the word crisis lightly. Government funding in adult education has fallen substantially in recent years. For example, in England, funding will be £1 billion lower in 2025 than it is in 2010. So there's a real serious lack of investment by government. And this has led to a falling participation in adult education and a move towards fee-paying courses. There's also been a fall in employer investment in skills. Employers have a huge role to play. In 2019, they invested 42 billion in training their employees, so a huge force in skills investment. But that investment since the financial crisis has also been falling, and the numbers of days employees spend in training is currently at its lowest level since 2011. I'm now going to give a little point of hope. So L&W, we've been tracking adult participation in learning for the last 25 years. And what we found in our annual surveys that since the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a rise in learning. So learning is now back at the levels it was in the 2000s. And this has been driven not by government-funded education, not by employer-funded education, but by individuals investing in informal, independent, often online learning. And I think that rise is actually really encouraging, and it's something we're really interested to look at with UFI, looking at how technology can help to address the challenges in learning that I've represented. And then to bring it back down with another negative note, this is the point that Josh made. we have to recognise the inequalities in adult learning. So we know that adults who are younger, from a higher socioeconomic background, already highly qualified or already in work, are much more likely to engage in learning. And this has been consistent in our survey since it started 25 years ago. So these are endemic inequalities that persist. And so what I'm really looking forward to doing with UFI over the next few years is finding ways to address these challenges, because we know that in order to develop the skills needed for economy and transition, we need to take everyone in society with us. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about how we can make that happen. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Jess. Yes, quite stark start, but also a good challenge to do better. And I liked that challenge. So Richard, thank you so much for making the time today. In his opening letter to the Green Paper, Stephen Evans, the CEO of the Learning and Work Institute, writes that the UK skills base lags behind many comparator countries, and those with the lowest qualifications and in the lowest paid roles, so something that Jess just underlined, are least likely to take part in learning, and we need to meet the skills needs of the future, including our transition to net zero. So with your work as the co-founder and CTO of Greenworks, you're tackling that exact problem. And so I was curious to see if you recognise the three problems in the Green Paper that were identified, but specifically one of those problem areas, that the skills and learning opportunities that are needed to support an economy in transition are neither clear nor equitably accessible. So this is something that you've talked about before, specifically in terms of stakeholder awareness of in-demand roles like retrofit assessors. So I wondered if you could kind of, share with everyone here, what you're seeing on that front, and again, how it relates to bring some solutions to that particular problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie. So just to give a little bit of context for all of you joining us. So Greenworks, we're a climate edtech startup. We get people to green jobs. These are the jobs which are critical for net zero infrastructure, jobs like solar panel installer, heat pump engineer. They're all the roles that actually are needed to get this green infrastructure actually kind of deployed, boots on the ground, trades and professions. And what's really interesting is we see a lot of the problems which Josh, Sophie and Jess have been speaking about through that prism of these green jobs for sure. Sophie mentioned this one called retrofit assessor as an example. So retrofit assessor is a job that most people have not heard about. And so if you're sitting with school and you're like, I have no idea what a retrofit assessor is, I wouldn't at all be surprised. There's actually a massive need for them. So it's forecast that by 2030, we need 50,000, just in the UK, 50,000 retrofit assessors. Why do we need them? What do they do? It's all about decarbonising our homes. So you will probably all remember from the energy bills crisis, it was really brought to home that actually the UK homes are really energy inefficient, very leaky, like even things like insulation, like very low hanging fruit, not done very well. And so there's a massive need to get all these kind of properties retrofitted and get better insulation, get solar panels, but also have them inspected, make sure that we understand what's going on with these buildings. And essentially, that's the role of a retrofit assessor. This is someone who goes into homes and sort of make sure that we've got the right data, information about household energy usage to make informed improvements to that building. And it's a role which has really, really high importance. It's got really, really high needs. And it's surprisingly accessible a lot of the time. So you don't need a degree, you don't need any particular A levels, you actually don't even really need any particular GCSEs to start training up for this role. But there's very, very poor awareness of this. You can imagine that so many of you here probably never heard of this role. And of course, all the learners who might be out there who might be great for this job, where starting salary can be 24, maybe even £28,000 a year. That's actually, of course, a fantastic opportunity for lots of people. They're just not aware of this opportunity existing. And so I think there definitely is a problem especially when for an economy in transition, it means a skill need and an awareness of this can change quite quickly. And so what that means is then there's a lag between, of course, the need being identified and it filtering down to people who actually this is a fantastic opportunity for, because most careers advisors have never heard of retrofit assessor. Most parents have never heard of retrofit assessor. And so a big problem that we see is about making sure that when there are these opportunities out there, which are really important, very accessible, very meaningful, very well paid, How do you then get it out there to the people who can actually then so they've got the information they need to be like, oh, you know what, okay, I understand this as a thing which I could in principle do. But then they also understand what the pathways are around that, because a lot of time the pathways can appear very convoluted and complex. And what we need is some clear signposting of like, okay, you know, you can be a retrofit assessor. Well, what does that mean? This is what the job means, and this is the specific pathway, the steps that you can take in order to do that. And this is, I've obviously gone deep on one particular thing like retrofit assessor, but we can imagine that for a whole myriad of roles, the same problem is reproduced for sure.
Yeah, that's so interesting and seems to match up. We have a question here from Siobhan. Hopefully I've done that pronunciation correctly. That, you know, one of the problems that they're grappling with is determining how to identify the UK's long-term skills need and subsequently how to embed that into, you know, what they currently need to adapt now in order to account for that. So there's something there about, you know, shortening that cycle of identifying those jobs and the pathways to get there much more quickly, I think, seems to be coming out. So and Richard, just before you go, there was a piece in the paper around soft skills as well, and there's an interesting dynamic around this need for more technical roles, so some of the roles that you mentioned, but also hand in hand with improved soft skills. And again, I think that's something that you've been quite passionate about. So I don't know if you wanted to kind of share your take on that side of things as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie. So we absolutely see that both of these things are important. There's the actual kind of technical skills, but also the soft skills or some form of the essential skills which are needed. So why are both important? Let's again think about this sort of retrofit role. We're going into people's homes, and we are making changes to their homes. And homes are a really important personal private space for people. That's a really trusted space. And so to invite someone into your home really requires them to build a good rapport with you and to be a good communicator about, okay, here's some of the things that we understand about your property. Here's some of the things that we might need to do. And here's why we might need to do. And here's what it looks like next. And so there really is like paramount importance that we have both of them together. And we often see that these are considered separately. So you maybe have a course which is very focused on, okay, let's learn everything that you need to do about retrofit, and completely neglecting things such as like, how are you going to communicate this very dense information? How will you communicate this in a digestible way to those homeowners? And then when it comes to sort of considering the sort of soft skills in isolation, it's sort of like, well, we really are interested in a way where we make it as practical as possible and as job focused as possible, where it's specific exercises, even something like, okay, you're going to visit this kind of homeowner and you just need to have like text message exchange with them to explain, okay, like, hey, you know, nice to meet you, Joan, like, this is your retrofit assessor, Mark, and I'm arranging an appointment, you know, what times are you free? And you know, very specific, tangible things like that, which people can get better at, but are often underappreciated in this sort of skills need, I think.
Thank you, Richard. Kim, hello.
Hi there.
So I'd like to turn to you now, and I'm going to do the same thing. So a little quote from the paper. So the Green Paper states, "The UK is not currently developing the skilled workforce it needs for our changing economy. There are increasing numbers of older and disabled people outside the workforce. Changes in immigration have affected our ability to fill skills gaps, and the workforce continues to age." And so one of the problem statements is around digital technology for an economy in transition, both at the individual and system level, and that faced with a changing world, we are not acting fast enough to adopt and embed the technology necessary to creating accessible lifelong learners. And so for older workers, it made me think there's this individual bias against older workers, so at the individual level, and then that the system is primarily geared towards younger learners, perhaps. So yeah, I wondered if you would sort of agree on that take and what your experience is, and what you're seeing at the Centre for Ageing Better as well.
So just as a little bit of background, Centre for Ageing Better is a What Works organisation, and in my part of the organisation, what we're struggling with, tackling, is the challenge of extending working lives for those people that want to work. So there's been a lot made of this year in the news about the great retirement, I think it's known of. We know that since COVID, the people that have been most affected have been actually the older workers. Younger workers were in the first instance, but a lot of the younger workers have returned. The younger people have returned to the labour market. Older workers have stayed outside the labour market and chose to deliberately. But quite a lot of them say that they would want to return if they could, but that they don't like how the labour market works for them. And that is interesting in itself, that we've got this untapped resource, which I would argue is not just a part of a result of Brexit, actually. What we've got is a demographic of an older population. For some, I really welcome the report recognising up front the demographics, both in terms of age and disability, because this isn't something that's just happened because of Brexit or because of COVID. This was always going to happen. This is the feature of British society. It's not going to go away. And if you look further into the future, the birth rate falls even more. So as a society, we need to normalise longer working lives. And at the minute, culturally, that's a bit of an anathema, actually. We've been conditioned, particularly the group that are in their 50s and 60s at the moment, to expect a retirement around that age. But in fact, 40 years working life isn't going to sustain life expectancy. Life expectancy, if you're 66 today and a woman, you've got a 1 in 3 chance of living until you're 94. And that is really, you're going to have to put away quite a lot of savings to be able to sustain that sort of life. So we need to think about lifelong learning as a fact, and that in your working life, you're going to have 2 or 3 different jobs. And the way that the labour market changes more rapidly, the fact of the matter is we're going to have to equip individuals to be more responsive to that, and to just, as a matter of fact, understand that they're going to have to reskill 3 or 4 times. Now, that is a challenge to us culturally, because it's almost, if you haven't retired at 50 in our systems, you failed in some way. You should have put that savings away, and that's what you should aspire to. In fact, when we look at the way that organisations respond to older workers, access to training dips off the older you get. So you look at people in employment, they take up less training. And when you measure appraisals are actually not as effective as they are for younger people. There's a discomfort with younger managers managing older people. And there's a hierarchy in terms of organisations, still a pyramidical hierarchy, that older people tend to be the more senior people. And so we don't see that movement up and down in the organisation. Although when we talk to lots of older workers, as they move into their 50s and 60s, they would be quite happy to take less responsibility, to be reducing their stress levels, and to be working more flexibly in more junior roles. So there's something culturally we need to think about. And I think one thing that I would flag that I think relates to this green paper is the very recent commission in DWP have done on in work what they're calling midlife MOT. So they've commissioned 3 pilots. Midlife MOT stem back to the Cridland review of pensions way back in 2017, where there was a recommendation, and unfortunately the label stuck, that there's a midlife assessment for people 45 to 55, where they make an assessment of their position health-wise, finance-wise, and most importantly and relevantly, in this case, their careers. So we actually start to do career planning midlife rather than the most active career planning, which goes on as you leave full-time education and moving into the world of work. And I think that change to start to ginger up career planning and to introduce a step change in midlife around the 45 it's aimed at, the pilots, will naturally start to generate a requirement of appropriate skills and training. And if I go on to the specifics of it, of skills and training, when we speak to older workers, we have a project in the West Midlands, and the Learning and Work Institute is actually our evaluation partner on that project. When we speak to individuals in manufacturing and automotive, we're speaking to mostly about career changes. We know that that sector is in decline. I think we're going to come on to that when Rita talks. But we know there are lots of other sectors that are in growth in the West Midlands. The appetite for training is really strong. When we talk to the HR departments and the people that are managing those individuals, there's some quite stereotypical views of what those individuals aspire to. So that there's almost a damping down of the older workers' aspiration at that point. But what they do say to us is the way that training is delivered is not, it doesn't fit their lifestyle. It doesn't, what they want is actually digital training. They want it on a platform. They want it to be flexible. They want to fit it into the type of lifestyle they have. Many of them will have caring responsibilities. Some of them will have health needs of their own and access issues because their health is deteriorating, but not enough to stop them working. But most training is still delivered in a classroom situation, most appropriate to those people that are used to full-time education and are moving, you know, from the classroom into another classroom and are used to the teacher. And I'm not saying chalk and talk, I think we've moved on from that. But there's greater appetite than I think we know for digital training and flexible training. What we've seen on take-up, though, is that in that age group, relevance is really important. As we age, we're not as keen to take on training for training's sake, unless it's something we're very passionate about, that we've wanted to do for a long time, and we've got the time now to take that on as a subject. Most individuals want to take training where they can see a relevant job. They can see what the outcome is going to be when you've taken that training and achieved that qualification. So what Rich is talking about is very relevant. You see a lot of people moving into that because you could talk about the job, you could talk about the earnings that were involved, and the person can visualize when they've gone through this process, this is the job I'm going to do. And that, I think, is about motivation and access. And that makes a big difference then to application as well. They will continue with the training and they actually complete the training very quickly and to quite a high standard. I'll just say one more thing about elder workers because I could go on forever. There is a frustration there that many of the elder workers have got basic skills, but in a format that doesn't equate to current day standards. And we need to look at that. Some people are trained to quite a high level, actually, but the relevance of the degree that they got in 1980 is ridiculous, really. So there almost needs to be a different approach to some eligibilities and taking account of what those individuals have got. They do struggle, though, sometimes with training that they see as almost jumping through a gate because that's the rules. You've got to have maths because you haven't taken your maths so there should be some sort of entry level access assessment that is not as bureaucratic as I think we've got today. But what I would say is that once you've gone through that, there is great aptitude and skill. There's a group of workers, particularly those people that are transitioning, that are in work already, who are very tech savvy and very good at moving around tech in terms of being a delivery channel as opposed to the means to the end, as it being the means to the end. And I think we have a prejudice in society that, you know, if you weren't born in this millennium, you don't do tech. That's an absolute load of rubbish at this point. And we welcome this piece of work. We think there's a lot to do here, and we definitely feel that there's a massive chunk of work to do around older workers and workers transitioning, and that this has the potential to give us a really good gateway into longer working lives. I'll stop there.
I love that last point because my mother-in-law was one of the first sort of work at home IT consultants for Dame Stephanie Shirley. And yeah, she's totally all over the new tech before anyone else in the family. So the idea of sort of digital natives and young people knowing technology and old people not knowing technology is a bit of a fallacy. So
the main reasons for older workers leaving the workforce is flexibility and health, and tech is the solution to both. It gives you the work that you can do and you can do in a different form. Different access.
Yeah, and so the things I took from what you just mentioned there was sort of having a more micro learning or bite-sized approach to training and in using digital to make that accessible, but also this perception of value idea. So I think we talked about this before, that you were sort of saying that older workers tend to be more goal orientated. So unless there's like a very obvious reason for something, they're not going to necessarily engage in that as an action in and of itself. There's a couple of questions coming in. So I wonder if we jump to those and then we will ask some questions of Rita. So Maureen says, Kim, thanks for your insights. Very interesting. Some of the issues you described sounds like a renegotiation of the social contract with people in government with regards to retirement, which is a very interesting observation. So how do you think this will impact current workers?
Well, there's no doubt that what we struggle with at the moment at the centre is that we are pushing out the state pension age without actually compensating for that in any way in terms of our employment and skills support. So the retirement age, state pension age, is moving out, whatever, and it is a trigger for retirement. And at the minute, if you look at the IFS study into what's happened, it has created a group of very, very poor 65 and 66-year-olds. So we need to do something to remedy that. I think, though, as we move on, there is a greater understanding that there isn't a fixed retirement age and that it is different for different people. Certainly, as we age, that group 50 to 60 is a huge group. And depending on your socioeconomic background, your health and your need to retire is very different at different ages and life expectancy. But there is a greater expectancy of a longer working life in the higher economic backgrounds and in where there's strong health. And there are, until COVID, we were seeing more people working well into their 60s than ever before. We've seen a huge increase, and then COVID put a stop on that. And we feel that some people will return, but that we need more productive interventions to get those people back. I think the natural case of things will be that people will come back. People will come back into the workforce because it's good for your mental and physical health, and and financially people do need to, because they start to understand where they are.
I heard some very startling statistic about life expectancy and a correlation between the longer that you work and your life expectancy, and it was quite a few years for each year that you stayed in some type of employment. So yeah.
Well, that's true, but then it's a bit like the wine analogies. People that drink wine tend to be from higher economic backgrounds. People that stay in work at the minute tend to be from higher economic backgrounds anyway, and so there's that correlation with health and higher income is very strong. But when you look at well-being and mental health, people that retain some sort of work are happier. Because they keep their social connections, and often that is the thing that they value as much as they value in terms of finance as well.
Fantastic. So I'm going to turn to Rita, and then I have some questions for everyone as well. We'll jump into, we'll have pull some questions and points out from the chat. But so Rita, thank you so much, Kim, as well. And Rita, welcome. So you've been highly involved both in skills councils and strategies, and with the vantage point also of an employer in the UK. And you've described people and skills as the biggest barrier to growth for the automotive sector. So I wondered if you could talk about what you see within those barriers and how you're sort of approaching tackling them as well.
Sorry, thank you very much, Sophie, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come along today. I think the Green Paper was very interesting, but I think what's going to be more interesting is the discussions that it's going to be opening up, and even within the last half hour. I think some of these discussions are going to be really key moving forward, and I think there's a big piece around culture. About the attitudes, behaviors. For me, there's a big piece about individuals understanding how they learn, why they want to learn, how they reflect on their learning, how we learn, where do we learn from, how we create that natural environment. And I'd say it's also very noticeable that, as Kim said, since lockdown, we have had a lot of people who have, decided to retire. We've got that aging workforce, and people almost see is that I work or I don't work, and how do we bring that flexibility, that part-time also is in a lot of sectors. And I would also say what I've seen in the manufacturing engineering sector is not really readily available. And it's hard for people to work part-time. I worked part-time in this sector once, and my husband always said, you just did 3 to 4 days, the 5 days work in 3 to 4 days. You did the same amount of work. And looking even at retirement, one of the comments is, you're going to retire or not, because you'll just end up doing the same amount of work, but in less days. So I think culturally, we have to look at this difference, and we have to have different conversations around how people approach their approach to work, what they want from work. And I think that's another sort of cultural aspect that's definitely hitting, and you can see in the work environment, is the well-being is really, really important. That feeling that people are not stressed at work, that they have that work-life balance, that they, because in lockdown, you know, people saw more than just going to work. They developed greater connections with with their family, even greater connections with the environment around them. And a lot of people want to keep that. And I think one of the things that we've definitely seen is like there has to be a real change to management style. There has to be a change in how we manage our teams, how we interact with our teams, how our leaders interact with us, what's the leaders' expectations. And also, I think, again, that cultural piece, that, you know, again, going back to what you said, Kim, with regard to people maybe moving up a role, getting more responsibility, a higher level job. But maybe when you come to a certain age, you want to be part-time, you want to drop down again, you want less responsibility. But how can we talk about that openly and feel that we're still achieving what we want to achieve? And it's not you know, we're not compromising, or we don't feel we're able to do that anymore. You know, the conversation needs to be, well, what do I want out of my life, out of my work? And how do I achieve that? And take some of the stigma that we may have around those positions that we once held. And can we hold a lower position that somebody I managed is now my boss? But that's where we have to change the culture and the language and how our leaders interact, that, you know, we're all equal, but we contribute. So instead of being individuals, you know, it's that focus more on teams and what teams achieve. Sorry, I've just gone off at a tangent because I've been so impressed with, you know, that conversation that we've just started to open up.
No, it's a wonderful thing if it's creating lots of ideas. I mean, I guess what I was thinking off the back of, you mentioned environment and you mentioned culture, and, you know, when I think about the kind of culture that surrounds the automobile and automotive industry and the environment, a lot of that is tied to place. And I think there's a really interesting tension between accessibility enabled through digital and then that sense of belonging that sometimes, you know, very naturally through community and so on is attached to place. And so I guess a question to you, Rita, but also if anyone else wants to jump in with how they see that in relation to better access to skills and take up of those opportunities by that perhaps those that aren't already well served. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
So definitely, when I look at my wider background of interaction with the manufacturing automotive sector, you know, there's the barriers that they've got to learning. And if we look at those barriers as a start point, that place comes into it. So the barriers is around, yes, funding. The barriers is around releasing, you know, people out of the workplace to go and do training. You know, there's a barrier around time. There's also the barrier around whether people want it, where they see the value in it. You know, how can you then help as an employer develop that carrot and stick approach to that encouragement? So, you know, the digital and the use of digital technology, I think, is really key. But one of the things that's definitely coming out of industry is a realization that just transferring of knowledge is only part of the equation. And quite often we get that 10-20-70 rule, and sort of you get the 10% of your capability, you know, from training, where the 20% comes from those interactions you've got with people, and the 70% is that sort of experiential learning, going into a project, you know, really developing. And I'd also say is, you know, how can we actually develop that digital technology to enhance that 10-20 rule, so it allows for more interaction that helps develop that learning and helps develop those skills, and how, you know, through the VR you get that experiential learning that will really increase your knowledge and experience of learning, so that then you can go and apply that in the workplace. So I do see there is challenges there. I think we have to look at things differently. And I think one of the key things that came up in the report, and one of the terms, is collaboration, because I think there's too many people maybe doing the same thing. And what we need to be able to do is be able to take that expertise and create a solution, and maybe spend more time on actually what we do with the information and how do we apply the information. And I think definitely when I worked at the National Skills Academy for Manufacturing, that's what we saw out of like best practice learning is you got the information, that's fine, but it's what do you want to do with the information that's as important, and how you actually going to apply the information is even more important. And that's where we need to actually focus our attention.
Fantastic, thank you. Does anyone have anything to add on that tension between place and digital? Yeah.
If I can,
Josh.
yeah, I was just going to jump in and say it pulls on this really clear thread throughout the green paper, this point around place. And I know in the skills system problem statement, we talk about this, the tension that you were just discussing there, Rita, between place and between the possibilities of digital technology to offer learning anywhere and everywhere at the same time. And you know, I think I was reading through the comments, Jill Scott has made a really good point about how valuable place is in making learning relevant, something that we've already talked about being really central. You know, that relevant point again comes up really clearly throughout in the green paper. But how do we ensure the local relevance and ensure the local provision, you know, developed for each individual local area, does not preclude people from accessing the learning that they want to access when they want to access it? Because we know that as soon as learners have made a decision to learn, that's a momentous hurdle they have already crossed. And that, you know, at the moment you can find a course online that looks really good, but oh no, it turns out it's delivered in a different local authority to where you live, you can't get funding for it, you can't do it, and all those doors suddenly shut down. And that's a really big problem. So it's a systems level challenge in that there is a system that is too rigid and fragmented to allow people to learn the way they want to learn when they want to learn. But there is also a really important role that place then plays at the individual level in motivating people and engaging them in learning. Digital technology, as Rita was saying, is it can be central in not only bridging the two gaps, but also making each of them more effectively addressed. I think that's key. And also picking up on the value of learning point, I know we talk about that a lot in the green paper. It's not, you know, it's not just the employers that we've got to convince of the value of learning. It's learners that we've got to convince of the value of learning. That learning is something that they're gonna get something from at the end of the day. And I know, you know, we've done research in the past with the RSA looking at exactly that question of, you know, what motivates learners. But to speak to the value of learning, I think we also need to look at what we're saying. You know, what's the evidence that we have that this is going to improve things for employers, it's going to improve things for individuals? How can we make decision making better in the system? And, you know, that's one of the really central decisions I know that we're keen to look at in more detail.
Thanks, Josh. And yeah, Richard, I'll come to you. I just wanted to share this point from Paul Sutherland, which I thought was very interesting, around use of gamification and games to engage people in different pathways and skills development. And the point being that, you know, actually older people tend to also have a really strong uptake in terms of being part of that gaming community and people who use games as well. So it's quite an interesting observation. Richard, did you have a point on the place and digital side of things as well?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Sophie. So I think place is really important. Where place is important because it gets you closer to need, where the needs in a specific area may be different to needs in a different geographic region. And so if you think about place, then you can connect people to opportunities which are actually more relevant to them, because it's not going to need them to uproot themselves and travel across the country, say. And so I think there's a strong case there for place being important. It relates to what Josh was saying about decision making, you know, where it's not necessarily by sort of central diktat, but it's about, okay, well, actually, kind of we close to a need, and it's sort of related to something which I was seeing in chat as well around the kind of speed, direction of change, and also a question from Siobhan around kind of forecasting need, where I think essentially one of the key things that we need in a system is it needs to be responsive. Where sometimes it's very hard to forecast need like 20 years into the future. So instead, can we get a system such that we detect need and then respond to it. And so by being local place-based, we get a better read of, oh, actually, I see some things here and have got a span of control where I can be responsive to that. And then having identified need locally, then actually it might well be that there's an important role for digital technologies there, where digital doesn't mean geography agnostic necessarily. It means you've got a form which can be delivered anywhere, but maybe you're starting from being informed by, well, the local need is this. So now we need to get people in this community into this pathway. And okay, a part of that learning journey is now going to be delivered digitally, but it's very relevant to them.
Yeah, I think that's, sorry, someone was just about to jump in, I think. Rita, was that you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, if we can look at how some of these issues are and how we can actually break down the issues. I mean, we know with digital technology that is any place, anywhere, anytime. And, you know, we can go around the world with our phone and find out what's happening anywhere. And, you know, the digital technology is getting more sophisticated and getting more accessible with the gamification, although I think there's still more development needed so that it can be customized. And that's what I think we need to shift into, that where people can really take control and customize it. So I'm inclined to think, yeah, you know, have it accessed digitally. But then, as Richard's saying, place can be important is maybe more when you start to look at where the demand for those skills are. So then how do you actually support that? Because people can learn the skills anywhere, but where they apply those skills might be in a place. So, you know, are those two separate issues that we look to with regard to recruiting and developing, and versus, say, the core information and knowledge people can gain?
Thank you. So I'm gonna spend the next 8 minutes or so taking as many questions as we can from the Q&A feed here. And Debbie Colton, I'm going to start there because this is a really important point I think someone made earlier about how do we make sure that we're not in this ridiculous situation where people who are really skilled and have this incredible experience and knowledge that isn't lost because of the rigidity of our qualifications systems, essentially. And so, you know, I think in the Green Paper it talked about, you know, incredibly experienced migrant workers coming here and their qualifications don't fit in, or that example earlier of a worker with, you know, relevant experience, but the degree is now out of date. And so Debbie put here a paradigm shift to an ecosystem approach. Our research identifies there are 9 primary stakeholders in the competency management ecosystem and 144 demand supply interventions. Everyone talks about the skills system, but never define many definitions. So is that part of the problem, that it's so nebulous, and how do you stop it being so rigid that it's not fit for purpose, but also manage the beast, which is all of these different aspects of what makes up a skills experience and system, I suppose. Anyone have any thoughts they'd love to jump in with? Quite a difficult one.
The thing that maybe immediately comes to my mind where I can actually maybe relate it to is agile, you know, and project management. It's a complex environment, but are we trying to create 2 dedicated solutions? Do we need more of a framework approach and looking at more generic capabilities where people have that potential, but then depending on where they go, how they use that capability and that potential to be able to apply it to different situations? And then that actually then reflects back on to where do they tap into the support to allow them to do that from an individual approach or an experiential approach.
Thank you. We have another one here which relates to the funding side of the paper. So a key issue for providers, either FE or HE, public and private, delivering courses for employers in adult skills is firstly gathering cumulative demand for face-to-face courses, and many courses don't run as funding process is not geared or equitable for online courses. So there seems to be a sort of structural business model breakdown there slightly. Anyone God, Josh, I can see you're nodding your head.
Yeah. It comes back to a lot of the points that we've already discussed, isn't it? About the system that we've created that creates these odd and often perverse incentives to do different things with funding. And I think it ultimately comes back to the point that we don't really know what we want the skill system to do, other than that we want it to get people the skills we need for work, but we don't have a clear concept of what we're valuing and what we're talking about. And as a result, you end up with this incredibly fragmented picture. I mean, the one thing that came through over and over and over and over again from stakeholders that we're talking to is just the sheer complexity of the system itself. And as that plays out in funding, it also plays out in the way you access courses and the way you access learning, whether it's online or blended or through employers or through private providers or whoever it might be. And the system itself, I think, comes back to being the problem here. It's unclear policy.
Yeah, I mean, but then again, I mean that is definitely a challenge and a frustration, is because the way the system's set up, you quite often find that providers come to an employer with a sales proposition, and the employer's not interested. They're not interested in buying things. What they want is their people developed and their people capabilities enhanced to be able to do the job that they need them to do now or a future job. And you get a clash because it is that sales proposition compared to sitting down and understanding as an employer what I want and what do I need to move forward. And I always say is that look at what is it going to cost me. Don't sell me something. Look at what it's going to cost me for me to get what I need to get to be able to get my people for where I need them to be. But then there is the frustration now with the levy that employers pay into the levy and they can't tax it because sometimes it's like a straitjacket. It's not fit for purpose for what they need.
Just to add on to that point, I know we found again one of the big problems with getting employers or individual learners to access learning is just the sheer size of the qualifications we expect people to do. An apprenticeship is an enormous commitment in time and resources, and often wildly inappropriate for people who want to do a little bit of learning. And even recent innovations like the boot camps, they can be fantastic if you can take large chunks of time away from work, but if you can't, then they're no good. And we only the example being that you can do 4/5 of an apprenticeship and come out with nothing, but you've not got nothing. You've got 4/5 of an apprenticeship. You've done 4/5 of the learning, but we're not acknowledging what people are doing. And if we can make things smaller and more bite-sized, it makes it more accessible for everybody.
Thank you, Josh. I'm mindful of time. We've got 2 minutes left. And I'd like to throw this clanger into the chat. And I don't think we'll have time to talk about it now, but everyone should absolutely feed back on it in this process. So Spencer Holmes put, sorry, but a serious point is, of course, the inevitable impact of AI on skills and employment. And I think absolutely very critical point. And someone also put this earlier in terms of with green jobs, how many of those will actually be catered for and taken up by automated processes. So really, we've got 1 minute left. So I'm not sure if everyone wants to give, or Richard, perhaps if you want to give a 10-second thought on that, and then again, I'm going to underline how we close the session and how people can get involved.
Thanks, Sophie. I'll speak very quickly. So AI obviously changes things a lot. What's interesting on automation, 10 years ago, I put this in the Q&A, but 10 years ago, people said, oh, it's a kind of manual trade roles that are going to get automated. And actually, we see with ChatGPT, a lot of conventional white collar, like copywriter-based roles are actually suddenly, whoa, these are kind of at risk. And things like retrofit, actually, they're non-trivial. Not all homes are the same, and you have specific needs. So actually, it looks like those roles are going to be a lot more resilient than some of the white collar roles, which people previously thought would be safer.
Great response. So thank you so much, everyone. The hour has flown past. I'd love to thank the panelists, and I'd love to reiterate, we would love to capture your responses. So make sure you've either read the green paper or do go and check it out. You can either download it from the website or it'll be in your email. And again, any feedback, I mean, we've got so much amazing feedback here, which we haven't had time to go through everything, but rest assured that will absolutely feed into the process. So thank you so much. And on behalf of UFI VocTech Trust, thank you. And Learning and Work Institute, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Take care.